Hello.
After my mother's passing, my father's new wife went to court, trying to strip me of parental rights so she could take my children for herself. I never imagined I'd find myself here, looking after my father after a tragedy that shattered us both. One moment, my mom was alive, telling me not to call her so often, and the next, her phone just stopped ringing. Even before the call came, I had this awful feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was terribly wrong. And when the call finally did come, I was right, it was the hospital. My mother had passed, suddenly, without warning. My father's life, like mine, unraveled in an instant. For as long as I could remember, my dad had been this rock-solid figure, holding us together even when he wasn't around much. He worked tirelessly at the factory, clocking long hours to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. There was this quiet, constant reassurance in him, as if he'd always be just one call away. But life, in its way, turned on him too. He lost his job and with it, his sense of purpose. It was like he went from being a man with a mission to a shadow of himself. After Mom was gone, he just seemed to fade. It wasn't long before the house they'd shared fell into foreclosure. The day I went to visit him there before they took it, he was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by my mother's things. His eyes were empty, as if the color had drained from his world. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his face pale and shoulders heavy with the weight of his loss. Seeing him that way broke something in me, especially when I realized he was too proud, or maybe too ashamed, to ask for help. In the weeks after, I was over there all the time, checking in on him. He resisted at first, but I kept showing up, doing what I could. At first, I'd just buy groceries, quietly pay bills that I knew he couldn't manage anymore. He'd never say thank you, but he'd give me this little nod or squeeze my shoulder. His pride and gratitude mixed together in that way dads have. But I knew he needed more than groceries or the occasional bill paid. He needed a place, a home where he could grieve and start piecing his life back together. So, I did the only thing that made sense to me. I started looking for a house. Just a simple, one-story place with a little yard he could work in if he wanted to. I remember the day I finally found it. A small, quiet house with a few friendly neighbors, a big oak tree out front, and a cozy little porch. I could already see my dad sitting there with his coffee in the mornings. The place felt right, almost as if my mom would have given it her nod of approval. When I told him about it, he looked at me with wide eyes, caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. He tried to argue, saying he didn't need the help, but I knew this was exactly what he needed. He couldn't accept that I was doing something so big for him. You should be looking after yourself, not wasting energy on an old man like me, he muttered, staring at the ground as if the words weighed more than he could bear. But I wasn't about to let him push me away. I told him this wasn't charity, this was family. I reminded him it was just a house, and he'd done a lot more for me over the years, providing for us through thick and thin. He finally caved when I threw that back at him. Deep down, I think he knew I needed to do this almost as much as he needed it. Moving day snuck up on us, and we boxed up what was left of his belongings, most of which were Mom's things. Packing up their life together was surreal, like we were folding away the past, tucking memories into cardboard and bubble wrap. There was a strange, quiet acceptance in it, though. Even if every step felt like scraping at an old wound, we were moving forward. When we pulled up to the new house, I saw something shift in my dad's face. He walked around slowly, from room to room, touching the walls and peeking out the windows, almost like he couldn't believe it was real. I stayed back and watched, giving him a little space to take it all in. In the first few weeks, he kept himself busy, rearranging furniture over and over again. He'd call me daily with a new idea for where the couch or the table should go. I knew it was his way of keeping his mind occupied, a way to fill the empty space Mom had left behind. But sometimes, the weight of it all would catch up with him, and he'd have days where he couldn't bring himself to get out of bed. Late at night, I'd get these calls from him just to talk. He never had much to say, but he'd ramble on about old stories I'd heard 100 times, as if they were fresh. Sometimes he'd just sit there in silence, the only sound his shaky breathing. It tore me up that I couldn't be there every moment to lift him up. After a while, I noticed small changes around the house. Curtains that my mom had sewn hung on the windows, her old mugs tucked into the cabinet. He was bringing little pieces of her into the place, making it feel like home in a way that kept her presence alive. As painful as it was, I think he needed those pieces of her to start settling in, to feel a sense of peace. A few months later, something shifted. I stopped by one afternoon and found him brimming with this excited energy I hadn't seen in ages. He'd taken up gardening, of all things. My dad, who'd never had a hobby outside of work, was now out there digging in a patch of soil, rambling on about growing fresh vegetables. I watched him with his hands trembling slightly but his face full of focus, planting flowers and seedlings. It wasn't just a garden. It was like he was planting his way toward a fresh start. For my dad, gardening wasn't just about planting vegetables. It was something to keep him going, a purpose he sorely needed. Then, one night, he called me over, saying he had something important to show me. When I got there, he was sitting at the table with a small, worn box in front of him. He opened it carefully, and inside was an old, frayed journal I'd never seen before. It was my mom's. She'd kept it for years, writing about everything from the day-to-day to her deepest hopes and dreams. With tears brimming in his eyes, my father explained that he'd only discovered it after she'd passed. He hadn't read much, he said he couldn't bring himself to, but he felt it was something I should have. To say I was stunned was an understatement. I had no idea my mom had kept a journal, let alone one filled with so much of her private self. Reading through it was like hearing her voice again, like she was reaching out to share pieces of her life she hadn't told us in person. I discovered sides of her I'd never known about, quiet fears, unspoken dreams, even little frustrations she'd never voiced. There were entries about my dad, too, filled with tender words and quiet concerns for his health, his long work hours, and this recurring hope that he'd find true happiness. The journal became a bridge between us, my dad and me. Sometimes I'd read parts of it to him, sharing little bits that would make him laugh or bring him back to moments he hadn't remembered in years. It was almost as if she were still with us, guiding him through his grief, offering him comfort. But his healing wasn't a straight path. There were days he'd fall back into bitterness, other days when he'd just sit quietly, lost in his thoughts as grief hit him all over again. Yet, as time passed and the seasons shifted, he began finding a kind of peace. He'd spend hours tending to his garden, even setting out a chair beside him, for Mom, just in case. He'd say with a bittersweet smile, "It wasn't easy, and nothing would ever be quite the same." But with that house, the garden, and her journal, he was slowly building a new life, carrying her memory with him. We both were. In those rare, calm moments, I felt closer to them, both my parents, than I ever had before. After a few months, though, I noticed something different in my dad. He started paying a bit more attention to himself, dressing a little sharper, trimming his beard, even asking me about cologne one day, which nearly knocked me off my chair. He seemed more alive, interested in things he hadn't cared about in years. Then he surprised me by joining a seniors walking group at the local community center. At first, I thought he was just doing it for the fresh air, maybe as an excuse to get out of the house. But it quickly became clear it was more than that. That's where he met Karen. Karen was vibrant in a way that caught me off guard. She had this big, booming laugh and a warm, welcoming personality that filled up a room. She'd call everyone honey within a few seconds of meeting them. I could see why she drew my father in. Her energy was downright contagious. Karen had been around the community center for a while, leading fitness classes, and apparently, she'd spotted my dad looking a bit out of place in the walking group crowd. The first time he mentioned her, it was subtle. He casually said that a friend had given him tips on improving his posture, telling him he should stand tall and proud. But I knew my dad well, and I caught the glimmer in his eye. It wasn't long before her name started popping up in conversation. Karen said this. Karen suggested that, eventually, he let it slip that they'd been seeing each other outside the walking group. The first time I met Karen, I wasn't sure what to expect. Dad invited me over for dinner, and when I walked in, there she was, greeting me with a warm hug that felt surprisingly familiar. Karen wasn't one to hold back. She chatted about everything from her favorite recipes to stories from her life before meeting my dad. She'd been widowed nearly a decade, had 2 grown daughters, and filled her days with travel and adventure. I could see how she filled the spaces in his life, the ones I tried so hard to fill but just couldn't. She made him laugh in a way I hadn't seen in ages. They'd share these quiet, knowing smiles, like teenagers with a secret, and it was impossible to miss the joy in his eyes. Watching them, I felt a mix of relief and something strange, a bit of worry that things might shift between me and Dad. But the happiness on his face left me with no doubt. I wanted this for him. I told him so, reassuring him that if Karen brought him joy, he had my full support. Before long, they were spending nearly every evening together, and he spoke about her as if she were already family. Then one morning he called with big news. He was thinking of proposing. I was floored, needing a second to catch my breath before I assured him I was behind him all the way. A few days later, Karen called me, nearly bursting with excitement, to tell me he'd asked. He'd taken her to the local park where they'd first met, and as they reached a bench under an old oak tree, he got down on one knee with a ring in hand. She was overwhelmed, saying it was the happiest she'd felt in years. They planned a small, intimate wedding, just close friends and family. The day arrived quicker than I expected. Dad looked dapper in the charcoal gray suit I'd helped him pick out. He was nervous but alive in a way I hadn't seen in years, almost like a man half his age. Karen was radiant. Karen looked radiant in a deep violet dress, simple yet elegant, with a lace shawl draped gently around her shoulders. There was something truly touching about seeing the two of them together, promising a future to each other in front of everyone they loved. The day was filled with heartfelt toasts and quiet, emotional moments. Karen's daughters stood close to their mom, looking so much like her with those same strong features and bright eyes. They held hands as they watched, their faces shifting between joy and a kind of tentative concern, much like the feelings I'd been wrestling with myself. After the ceremony, I found a quiet moment alone with Dad, just the two of us tucked away in a corner. He looked at me with this mix of pride and gratitude and admitted he hadn't felt so alive in years. I clapped him on the shoulder, telling him again that he deserved this happiness, that Mom would want him to feel whole and loved once more. After the wedding, everything seemed ideal. Karen moved into his house, and she brought her own lively spirit with her. She added soft throw blankets, vases with fresh flowers, and little notes she'd leave for him on the fridge. Every time I visited, she'd welcome me with a big, warm hug and a hot cup of coffee, making me feel as if I were her family too. She was full of energy, always up to something, and I could see the way she brightened up my father's life. As time went by, I found myself warming up to her and the joy she brought to him. But then subtle changes started to creep in. Karen's daughters began visiting more often, which seemed fine at first, until I noticed they'd often leave with things. First, it was just old books or knickknacks. Then it became bits of furniture, even some of Dad's tools. It didn't seem like much until I started noticing my father's confusion. He'd ask, puzzled, where his favorite screwdrivers had gone, or why his mother's old clock wasn't on the mantel anymore. Each time, Karen would just laugh, saying her daughters must have borrowed them and would bring them back soon. But I caught that small flicker of discomfort in my father's eyes. Despite my concerns, I kept reminding myself that my dad's happiness was what mattered most. Karen had pulled him out of that heavy grief, given him purpose again, and filled a void that had seemed impossible to mend after Mom's passing. I convinced myself that these little things didn't matter, even as a nagging feeling lingered in my gut. As the months went on, Karen began suggesting changes to the house. She was modernizing, she'd say, adding her own touch. My dad, eager to make her happy, agreed to every suggestion. Slowly but surely, pieces of my mom's memory, the curtains she'd sewn, the old quilt she'd loved, started disappearing or were packed away, out of sight. I kept my mouth shut, telling myself that this was my dad's home, not mine. Still, it felt different. A strange blend of the familiar and the foreign, like walking into a place that had once been mine but now felt like someone else's. Then came the first real shock. During a family dinner, Karen casually mentioned that her daughter Angie was having financial troubles and needed a temporary place to stay. My dad looked over at me, as if seeking approval, and I just couldn't say no. Karen reassured us it would only be for a few weeks until Angie got back on her feet. But a few weeks turned into months, and it became clear Angie wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. She started treating the house like her own, rearranging furniture, inviting friends over all the time. The whole atmosphere changed. My dad seemed torn, caught between wanting to support Karen and feeling uneasy about all the upheaval. When I asked him how he felt, he'd just sigh, brushing off my concerns, calling it a temporary adjustment, but I could see that it was eating away at him. One evening, I dropped by and found Angie in a heated argument with my dad over something small and silly. Her voice was raised, sharp with irritation, while Karen just stood quietly in the background, watching but not stepping in. A wave of anger hit me then, realizing how much my dad was sacrificing for a family that seemed to be pushing his boundaries. After they left, I pulled him aside and urged him to stand up for himself, to set some limits. He nodded, looking both grateful and defeated, like he knew I was right, but didn't have it in him to challenge Karen or her daughter. I watched as the light in his eyes began to fade again, the same way it had after Mom passed. He clearly loved Karen, but he was torn between his loyalty to her and his own self-respect. It was heartbreaking to see. Yet, I stuck by him, knowing that my presence was one of the few steady things he could count on. Sitting with him one evening, I saw the exhaustion etched across his face and realized this wasn't the happy ending I'd hoped he'd find. But he seemed determined to make it work, clinging to the love he'd found with Karen, even as it brought complications into his life. Then, the temporary changes turned into a revolving door. After Angie finally moved out to her own place, Karen's other daughters, Lisa and Emma, arrived with their own challenges, both in-between situations, as Karen put it. My dad looked hesitant, but Karen assured him, patting his hand and calling him honey, saying it would only be for a couple of weeks. He seemed lulled by her charm, as though her reassurances were all he needed to believe it would work out. But as I watched the house fill up, my dad's happiness slowly slipping away again, I couldn't help but feel an unsettling worry deep in my chest. Dad looked at me with an apologetic shrug, as if to say, "What choice do I have?" When Lisa and Emma arrived, they brought only a few bags and boxes but a lot of stories about how life had been throwing them curveballs lately. Lisa, the older sister, was around 30, tall with sharp features, and carried herself with a barely hidden irritation, like she was always slightly annoyed with the world. Emma, her younger sister, had a quieter, more reserved presence, but there was an aloofness about her, as if she were a bit above everything around her. At first, they stuck mostly to the guest room, keeping their things contained, or so it seemed. But soon enough, their belongings started creeping into the rest of the house. The shared spaces filled up with their stuff. The bathroom that had always been my dad's quiet space now had their brightly colored bottles and beauty products lining the counters. Boxes began to overflow from the guest room, spilling into the living room, stacked on tables and even on top of Dad's things. It wasn't just the clutter that bothered me, though. It was the way they treated my dad's things like they were trivial. One day, I walked in to find Lisa flipping through his old records, tossing them aside with a smirk and a comment about his outdated taste. Another time, I caught Emma in the garage, rearranging his carefully organized tools. She muttered something about how his system made no sense, completely ignoring the care he'd put into keeping things his way. And my dad, who had always been so careful about his belongings, just smiled weakly and mumbled that they were just making themselves at home. It made my stomach twist, this casual disrespect they showed, as though everything in his house was fair game. But the breaking point came one Saturday morning. I stopped by unannounced, only to be hit by a strong wave of perfume and the smell of burnt toast. In the middle of my mom's kitchen was Lisa, wrapped in a silk robe that definitely wasn't hers, stirring a pot on the stove with one hand while scrolling through her phone in the other, chatting loudly with a friend about some party she'd been to the night before. When she saw me, she just gave a dismissive wave and said, "Hey, what's up?" Barely even looking up. That casual, entitled attitude snapped something in me. This wasn't just a random roommate situation. This was my dad's home, the place I grew up in, and Lisa was acting like she owned it. I pulled my dad aside, unable to hold back any longer. "Dad, don't you see what's happening here?" I said, gesturing toward the kitchen, where Lisa was still holding court, completely at ease. "They're treating this place like a free-for-all." He just looked at me, his face a mix of confusion and resignation, and it hurt to see him so defeated, like he didn't even recognize his own home anymore. Dad sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, and said, "They're just going through a rough patch. You know? Karen says it's temporary, and I don't want to rock the boat." His voice was tinged with a weariness that bordered on denial. I could see he was uncomfortable, yet he couldn't seem to summon the strength to stand his ground. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. Lisa and Emma expanded into every corner of the house, subtly transforming each room into something colder and less familiar. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and felt like I'd stepped into a stranger's home. The old, worn sofa, which had once held countless family memories, had been replaced by a sleek leather one that Lisa had apparently picked up on sale. A new glass coffee table gleamed in front of it, courtesy of Emma, looking pristine and impersonal, like something out of a catalog. The room felt empty of warmth, stripped of the history and comfort my parents had built there. My father, once the quiet presence who filled the house with security, now moved around quietly, almost as if he were shrinking, a guest in his own home. One evening, I found him in the garage, hunched over a small workbench, tinkering with an old radio from his childhood. The garage was one of the last spaces that hadn't been overtaken by Karen and her daughters. As he fiddled with the wires, he muttered, "They've taken over, haven't they?" without looking up. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness that he was finally acknowledging it. But even then, he looked up at me with a helpless sadness in his eyes, like he didn't know what he could possibly do to take his life back. Around that time, the atmosphere in the house shifted from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Karen's daughters began hosting gatherings and inviting friends over at all hours. The quiet sanctuary my parents had created together had become a loud, chaotic space, a revolving door of strangers who laughed and drank late into the night, leaving empty bottles and messes for my dad to clean up the next day. I could see how it wore him down. He looked older, his shoulders slumped, his voice so soft it seemed almost swallowed by the walls. One evening, I came over and found Emma berating my dad in the kitchen, scolding him for not stocking the fridge with the right foods. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I stepped in, my anger finally spilling over, and demanded, "What right do you have to talk to my father that way?" Emma looked at me with a cold, defiant glare, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "It's our home too," she sneered. "Mom said we could stay here as long as we need. Don't act like you have any more right to be here than we do." Her words stunned me, and I just stared at her, my mind reeling. Our home? The entitlement in her voice was infuriating. But what hurt most was my father's silence. He just stood there, looking defeated, as if he had no voice in his own life anymore. My father just stood there, head down, unable to muster a single word in his defense. After Karen's daughters left, I pulled him aside, desperate to understand how much more he was willing to sacrifice for them. "Dad, how much longer are you going to let this go on? How much more of yourself are you going to give up?" He looked at me with weary eyes and, in a barely audible voice, whispered, "I don't know, son. I just don't know." The final straw came just a few days later. When I went over, I noticed immediately that something was missing. The antique cabinet, my mother's pride and joy, a family heirloom passed down from her parents, polished and kept pristine all her life. I asked Dad what happened to it, and he muttered that Lisa had taken it for storage, saying she could make better use of it. That was it. I couldn't hold back any longer. I went straight to Karen and confronted her, asking how she could allow her daughters to treat my father's home with such blatant disrespect. She looked momentarily surprised, maybe even hurt, but quickly brushed it off with a tight smile. "They're just adjusting," she said. "You should try to be more understanding." But there was nothing left to understand. This was my father's home, a place he'd built with my mother, and they were stripping it of everything that made it his. Memories of my mother, Her gentle ways, her pride in their home, came rushing back, and a surge of anger mixed with grief hit me. She'd never have allowed this. The changes didn't stop with the furniture either. My mother's old Labrador, Max, was also part of the family, her loyal companion in her final years, and he'd stayed faithfully by my father's side after she passed, as if carrying on a piece of her spirit. Max was gentle and calm, his once thick gray coat now a little thin and scruffy. He didn't ask for much, just to lie by my dad's side, content with an occasional pat on the head. But as soon as Karen and her daughters moved in, it was clear they didn't feel the same about Max. Lisa was the first to comment. One evening, as Max lay by Dad's feet, she wrinkled her nose and said, "Can't we do something about that dog? He smells." Max's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, but they drooped when he sensed her irritation. My father frowned, trying to brush it off, hoping the comment would go away, but it didn't. Emma joined in soon enough, pointing out the stray dog hair Max left behind or how he always got in the way when she was trying to cook. They would huff and sigh, as if his mere presence were a burden. Through all this, Max remained steady, not asking for anything, but it hurt to see him unwelcome in a house that had once been his safe haven. My father, too, seemed to shrink further with each day, pulled between his love for Karen and the respect he'd once had for his home and memories. As I watched, I could see it was no longer the place we'd known. It was slipping through his fingers, bit by painful bit. Whenever Max wandered into a room, Lisa and Emma would dramatically sigh or roll their eyes, as if his very existence were some great inconvenience. To my frustration, Karen didn't do anything to ease the tension. Instead, she subtly backed her daughters, nodding sympathetically when they complained or casually mentioning how hard it was to keep a house clean with a dog around. She'd even say things like, "We didn't have these issues before," as if Max were a problem that had only now been discovered. One afternoon, I dropped by and found my dad sitting on the porch, Max resting his head on Dad's knee, whining softly. My father looked up at me, weariness etched into his face. "They don't like him," he said quietly, scratching Max behind the ears. "They think he's too much trouble, too messy or something." He shook his head and sighed, adding, "But he was your mother's. He's family." Hearing that tore at me. The thought of them pushing him to give up Max, this last piece of my mother, filled me with a helpless anger. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a living reminder of the love and warmth Mom had brought into my dad's life. Over the next few weeks, the tension around Max only grew worse. Lisa and Emma's complaints became more frequent and direct. They'd leave the back door open on purpose, hoping Max would wander outside. More than once, Dad had to search the backyard to find him after someone left the gate open. He'd come back inside looking tired and frustrated, but he never said anything to them. Then came the final straw. One evening, I arrived to find Karen and her daughters huddled in the living room, speaking in hushed voices. As I approached, I overheard Lisa say, "Why don't we just take him to a shelter? He's an old dog. It's not like he'll know the difference." Couldn't believe my ears. I stormed into the room, furious. "You'd put him in a shelter?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. "Max is my father's dog, my mother's. He's family." Karen looked startled but quickly regained her composure, her expression smoothing into a mask of forced sympathy. "We were just discussing options," she replied calmly, though her tone held a defensive edge. "The house is getting crowded, and Max, well, he's old. He sheds everywhere, and it's becoming a lot to manage." Just then, my dad entered the room, drawn by the raised voices. He looked around, sensing the tension but unsure of what had ignited it. Before I could explain, Lisa turned to him, putting on a face of feigned compassion. "Dad, it's just, he's an old dog," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. My father looked down at Max, who had come to sit loyally by his side, and for the first time, I saw a deep sadness in his eyes that was mixed with a quiet, resigned anger. Lisa's tone turned annoyingly patronizing. "Maybe it's time to let him go, for everyone's sake. He'd probably be happier somewhere else. Maybe a farm or something." My father stood there, shoulders slumped under the weight of her words. I could see the pain and conflict tearing him apart. He loved Karen and was desperate to keep the peace, but Max was the last living link to my mother. Giving him up would feel like losing her all over again, like erasing the final part of her memory from the house. I couldn't stand by and watch them bully him into this decision. I took a deep breath, stepped forward, and said, "That's enough. Max isn't going anywhere. If he's really that much of a problem, I'll take him with me." "But you're not getting rid of him." My father looked at me, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. He gave me a small, grateful nod, like a weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders, if only slightly. I knew it broke his heart to let Max go, but he couldn't bear the constant tension in his own home. A few days later, I arrived to pick up Max's dad tried to keep a stoic front, but his eyes betrayed him, glistening with pain as he knelt to scratch Max behind the ears one last time. Max seemed to sense something was wrong. He whimpered, nudging Dad's hand with his nose. "Take good care of him," my father whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He was your mother's heart, you know. She'd want him to be happy." I promised him I would, swallowing hard to keep my own tears at bay as I led Max out. The old dog trotted alongside me, head held high, but he kept glancing back at my father, as if he didn't understand why he was leaving the only home he'd ever known. Once we got to the car, I gently loaded him in, patting his head and murmuring reassurances. I wasn't sure if they were more for him or for myself. As I drove away, I felt a surge of anger toward Karen and her daughters. They'd already taken so much from my dad, his home, his sense of peace, and now they'd pressured him into giving up one of the last pieces of his life with my mother. Max had been his quiet, loyal companion, asking for nothing and causing no trouble, a faithful friend and a link to a life that was being systematically erased. Over the next few weeks, I did my best to make Max feel at home. He adjusted quickly, seeming to recognize he was safe and loved. But every so often, I'd catch him sitting by the window, gazing out as if waiting for my dad to come for him. It was heartbreaking to watch, but I knew it was for the best. The tension at my father's house had reached a point where he could barely breathe, and having Max there had only made things harder for him. My father called often, checking in to see how Max was settling. My father's voice was filled with both longing and gratitude each time he called, asking after Max. He'd ask about the smallest things, whether Max was eating well, if he was getting enough walks. I assured him every time that Max was doing fine, that he was adjusting to a new routine and seemed content. But we both knew it wasn't the same. One day, I decided to bring Max back for a visit. As we pulled up, my dad was already waiting on the porch, his face lighting up at the sight of us. He knelt down, pulling Max into a tight embrace, gently scratching behind his ears the way he used to. For those few moments, it was like old times again, as if the three of us were wrapped in a small bubble untouched by the changes that had swept through his life. But as the visit came to an end, I could see the sadness in his eyes. He knew he'd made a painful choice, one that had cost him a part of his heart. Karen's family had created a divide between him and Max, and there was no going back. As we drove away, Max turned to look out the window, his gaze fixed on my father until the house was completely out of sight. I reached over and patted him, feeling a pang of sadness myself. I knew he missed the life he'd left behind. We both did. After Max left, it was as if Karen and her daughters felt they'd won some unspoken battle, like they'd removed the last vestige of my father's life with my mother. The changes in the house became even more obvious. Karen took it upon herself to redecorate everything, changing furniture, wall colors, stripping away any trace of what had once been my father's. The house felt foreign now, a hollow shell of the home where I'd grown up. My father, who had once taken such pride in maintaining his home, was now almost entirely excluded from decisions. Whenever he tried to voice an opinion, Karen would wave him off with a patronizing, "Oh honey, we're just updating things for everyone's benefit." Her daughters were no better, treating his preferences with open disdain. Slowly, I saw my father retreat inward, as if he were becoming a stranger in his own home. He grew quieter, his once vibrant presence now a shadow. Around this time, I began to notice worrying changes in him. His appetite dwindled, he was constantly tired, and his usual upbeat spirit was fading into resignation. I urged him to see a doctor, and after a series of tests, he was diagnosed with an aggressive illness. The news hit me hard, but I could see it took an even greater toll on him. He was moved to hospice care, where he could receive the round-the-clock attention he needed. Karen's reaction to my father's illness was disturbingly detached. She visited him, but it was clear that her main concerns were the house and her daughter's stability. Her questions increasingly turned to what would happen to the property, how long he might remain in hospice, and what arrangements would be necessary afterward. While my father lay there, I spent as much time as I could by his side, comforting him and reminiscing about the past. It was painfully clear his thoughts were on my mother, the home they'd shared, and the life he felt slipping away. In his weakened voice, he would often tell me, "Take care of the house. It's all that's left of her. Make sure they don't take it away." I reassured him that the house was safe, that I'd do everything in my power to keep it in the family, as he and my mother had always wanted. Eventually, the day I dreaded came, and my father passed. I was overcome by a mixture of grief and determination, knowing I had to fulfill his last wishes. After making arrangements, I knew it was time to confront Karen and her daughters about the future of the house. I sat Karen down in the living room, now unrecognizable from the home I'd grown up in, and spoke as clearly and directly as I could. "Now that my father has passed, I'll need to arrange for rent payments if you're planning to stay here," I said, bracing myself for her response. Karen's face went pale, then twisted in shock and anger. "Rent? We thought—" "Well, your father promised we'd be taken care of," she stammered, her voice shaking slightly. I took a steadying breath and explained the reality. "The house has always belonged to me legally. It was never in my father's name, so any promises he may have made can't be honored. If you want to stay, it will need to be under a rental agreement." At that moment, her daughters burst into the room, having clearly been eavesdropping. Lisa's voice was sharp with indignation. "Are you seriously telling us we have to pay to live in what's basically our home? After everything we've done to make this place livable?" Emma, equally outraged, added, "This is practically Mom's house now. She was his wife. How dare you act like she's some stranger?" Their entitlement stunned me, but I stayed firm. I reminded them that the house legally belonged to me, that my father had wanted it to remain in our family, and that I was simply honoring his wishes. The next day, Karen called, her tone a strange blend of outrage and desperation. She demanded to know how I could betray my father's memory by kicking his family out. Patiently, I reminded her that she and her daughters were welcome to stay, if they were willing to pay rent. Furious, she hung up on me. It wasn't long after that I received a letter from her lawyer, stating that Karen was suing me, claiming my father had verbally promised her the house and asserting that she had a right to it. Karen and her daughters argued that they had the right to stay indefinitely, claiming that Karen had poured her time and energy into the home and deserved compensation if she were forced to leave. The lawsuit was emotionally exhausting, but I was determined not to let them distort my father's wishes. The trial dragged on, with Karen and her daughters making increasingly outrageous claims about how my father had intended the home to be theirs. They cited vague, unverifiable statements and exaggerated their so-called contributions to the household. In court, Karen claimed my father had assured her that she and her daughters would always have a roof over their heads. She painted herself as the devoted wife who'd supported him in his final days, even claiming that she had saved him from loneliness. Lisa and Emma added their own dramatic testimonies, saying they'd made the home livable and accusing me of betraying my father's wishes. Their arguments were filled with emotional flair, but ultimately, they had no legal basis. My lawyer presented the clear documentation showing that the house was legally mine, a decision my father had made years before Karen came into his life. The judge listened to Karen's emotional pleas but made it clear that without legal proof of ownership, she had no right to the property. The ruling was in my favor. Karen and her daughters had no legal claim to the house and would need to vacate. When the judge issued the decision, Karen looked stunned, her usual confidence drained from her face. Her daughters, once so defiant, were expressions of disbelief and frustration. After the ruling, I went to the house to discuss their arrangements for leaving. Karen met me at the door, her face pale, her eyes cold. "I can't believe you do this to family," she spat, her voice laced with bitterness. I held firm, reminding her that my loyalty was to my father's memory and that I was honoring his wishes. Walking through the house after they left, I felt a sense of reclaiming the past. Beneath the clutter and chaos, I could see the familiar touches that my parents had once lovingly placed. The walls, floors, and small details still echoed with traces of my mother's warmth. The day they moved out was chaotic. Lisa and Emma stomped around the house, sighing loudly and muttering complaints as they packed. Karen avoided eye contact, her gaze fixed on the ground as she supervised the move. When they finally left, the house was in disarray. Bits of trash and scattered belongings left behind, rooms in a state of careless disarray. It seemed almost intentional, like they wanted to leave their mark one last time. But as I looked around, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. The house was mine again, and with it, a part of my family's history that I was determined to preserve. It would take work, but I knew I could restore it, bringing back the warmth and memories that had once made it a home. After they'd gone, I stood in the empty house, my heart pounding in the thick silence. The emptiness was raw, almost haunting, yet beneath it was a strange comfort, a sense of reclaiming something that had been slipping away. Slowly, I began clearing out every last reminder of their presence, scrubbing away stains and rearranging the furniture piece by piece, putting it all back the way my mother had once lovingly arranged it. Each movement felt like peeling back layers of resentment and bitterness, revealing the home I had known, the home my parents had cherished. For weeks, I worked relentlessly, driven by a mix of grief and determination to restore the house to its former self, to erase every trace of Karen's influence. Every scrub, every repair felt like a tribute to my parents, an act of defiance against the shadow they had tried to cast over my family's legacy. Friends and family joined me, bringing their strength and love to the effort. Together, we rebuilt the spirit of the place, brick by brick and memory by memory. In the end, standing there, I felt a surge of victory and gratitude. I had reclaimed what they had tried to take, protecting my parents' memory and the life they'd built. The battle with Karen and her daughters had been bitter, exhausting, but it was worth every sleepless night to know that this house, the heart of my family, was finally safe. I felt a fierce, quiet peace settle over me as I looked around. I'd fulfilled my father's last wish, held fast to the promise I made him in his final days. The house was mine again, but more than that, it was free. Every wall, every corner, felt alive with memories of my parents, almost as if they were still here, their love and spirit woven into every inch.
Bye bye.